Hi, Mick Wall. Welcome to 10 by 6.
Hello, hello.
Celebrated rock journalist. I mean, there's such a, from chief bottle washer, dishwasher, right through to rock music presenter, radio, television, working for Sounds, Kerrang, you name it. So I've grown up with you, Mick. So my music tastes are quite similarly aligned, I think, but I've grown up with you with Sounds and Kerrang and etc. So it's an absolute privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That point you made about musical interests, that's actually not my main motive, if that's the word.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of rock music I like. There's an awful lot of rock music I don't like. And my tastes in music go way beyond rock music. But what has always drawn me to that genre and those artists are the stories. You know, I'm when I was the editor-in-chief on classic rock, you know, I helped start the magazine. I built it over the first 5 years. The message I had to kind of convey and reconvey to the people that were writing for me and working for me was, we're not in the music business. You know, we're in the magazine business, or I'm better known as an author now. I'm in the book business. I'm in the story business. I mean, I think especially now, I always felt that people had already made up their mind about music for themselves. They didn't need me to nudge them along. But I think even more now, you've got the history of music right on your phone. Less and less do you need someone to guide you, I think, particularly. And if you do, there's loads of gatekeepers and arbiters, whether it's people on Spotify or the broadsheets. None of those places, either they didn't exist or the broadsheets didn't touch pop music or rock music, really until the last sort of 10 or 20 years. But more than ever, I'm that's not my purpose. My purpose is to tell you the truth. And that's something the artists are always extraordinarily reluctant to tell. Because they lie to themselves. You know, we all do to a degree.
And they're surrounded by sycophants, aren't they?
Always.
Yeah.
But from a very, very young age. And, you know, these aren't highly, some are definitely, but in the main, these are not highly educated people. They're not, unless they're lyric writers, they're not particularly introspective. And even then, you know, some of the great rock lyricists I know aren't remotely introspective. They're just into crafting great epics and mythological tales and crazy stuff. And they're kids, and they make it really, really big. They're very, very young, most of them, and I don't expect them to have a degree of self-awareness and insight, and also contextualizing the whole story of rock compared to other bands. Every band thinks that what they went through is unique to them. And it really isn't. You know, yesterday I was talking to Greg Rowley, co-founder and singer in Santana, Journey. He's in the Ringo Starr All-Star Band now. And wonderful guy, talking for a long time. And he was telling me things that he felt, you know, what do you think of this? And I kind of had to let him down gently, explain, well, actually, that's sounds like a really common experience of every band I've ever known. How as soon as you all started making money and having success, that's when the shit happened. Really? Who'd have guessed? You know. So yes, the music is important. It really is. But it's the people, the stories, and that's what I try and do, because the best music biographies, the best music journalism has nearly always been focused away from rock and metal. I mean, as far back as Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin being absolutely ridiculed in the music press, at a time when the music press was extraordinarily influential, particularly for groups like that you weren't going to see on TV or hear on the radio in the daytime. They were utterly scornful. If anything, they're more encouraging now that the bands don't really need them anymore. But it means that, you know, the great biographies have been written on the Beatles or Dylan or the Stones or whoever it might be. And from the earliest days of my career, I just thought, my God, this is like an Aladdin's cave of amazing stories. You know, some of the bands I first worked with as a 19-year-old, rock bands, were UFO, Thin Lizzy, AC/DC. I got to tell you, you're sitting in a room with some of those, Bon Scott, Phil Lynott, and they're telling stories. Phil Mogg, Pete Way, and they're telling stories. Man, you are gripped. You are gripped. It doesn't matter if the gig was good that night or shit that night. Sometimes the shit gig nights produce the biggest laughs and the best stories, as well as punch-ups and God knows what else. And they have huge careers. You know, I worked with a lot of pop stars. In 1981, I was the press officer at Virgin Records, and we did Simple Minds, Japan. We just signed Culture Club, but they didn't have a record out yet. But the one I remember most is the Human League, who'd been this fairly obscure NME type electronic group from Sheffield. And then two of them split, leaving Phil Oakey, and he put together the lineup that recorded the Dare album. And huge album for the pop world, Don't You Want Me Baby and all those, 4 or 5 hits. But it never really took off anywhere else. And they were the biggest pop group in England by the end of 1981. And yet if you went to America or Germany or Australia or Japan or wherever, they maybe might have heard of them. Yeah, and 5 years later, the peak of their career was over. 2 years later, it was over. And I'd worked with a lot of groups like that. Stray Cats I did a lot with, and that was Here Today, Gone Later Today. And the point I'm eventually going to get to is pop groups live fast, live short. They can be huge in Britain, complete nobodies everywhere else in the world. Rock bands, metal bands, with these epically proportioned spectacles that are their shows and music that is so visceral. And it's all album-oriented music. You know, the culture was very kind of anti-hit single, although lots of them, I mean, Deep Purple had several, Black Sabbath had 1 or 2, UFO had 1 or 2, you know. But they were always album. That's where they made their bones, was on an album and on a stage, not on a single or Top of the Pops. And their careers go worldwide, and they last forever. So that's why quite quickly I went, this is the stuff that interests me. Because the very first groups I wrote about in 1977 were punk groups. The first time I went on the road with a group was the Lurkers. And I was in the back of their equipment van, along with them, going to Bradford on a Sunday morning to play in a pub and then drive home the next morning. It only took about 5 or 6 hours from London. Of course, the van broke down. And then literally a couple of months later, I'm at the Hammersmith Odeon in London with Thin Lizzy. And after the show, I'm in a limousine with Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson. And we're on our way to a party full of Page 3 girls, George Best, Alex Hurricane Higgins, a load of gangsters, and every face in town from the music business. And I was like, Lurkers, pub in Bradford, Thin Lizzy. I mean, it was, you know, forget it. I mean, I was 18. I was 18 when the Sex Pistols and the Damned and the Clash released their first records. I didn't really care for the Clash, but I liked the Damned, I liked the Sex Pistols. But I felt it kind of spoiled things. By the time I was 18, I was living in a hippie house. Everyone had hair and clothes, and I just felt punk was very kind of monochrome. You know, it was my in to becoming a writer on sounds, but it wasn't at all what I was interested in. I liked some of the music. I didn't like the culture. I didn't like that mean-spirited little England kind of mentality. I'd always my joke dream was always to be in a limousine, or a Rolls Royce that goes into a swimming pool, or guys riding motorbikes down hotel corridors. You know, this is what I was looking for, not, you know, oh, I hate America and there are no jobs, and you know, I just couldn't be getting with it. So, but always the stories, always the stories. And the punks didn't have stories that interested me, but the rock stars, these giants, always to this day enthrall me with their stories.
Retrospectively then, Mick, looking back to your 19-year-old self and then moving forward to where you are now, do you perceive it differently though? I mean, obviously the impact of punk was very influential on the 80s and new romantics and new wave and that sort of music, which then in itself was instrumental in the indie and the alternative scene that came later. So while you were in it, it obviously sounded quite mundane perhaps and parochial, but later looking back on it, do you see it differently?
No, no, I don't. I you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I was that 18-year-old buying Anarchy in the UK, buying the first Damned album. All my friends, we all cut our hair and made it spiky, and I dyed my hair black, and suddenly couldn't wear my flares anymore, which was heartbreaking, but you know, you just couldn't. No, I was immersed in it, and there was some. I also worked at Step Forward Records with Mark P and Miles Copeland, and we worked on the Fall, Alternative TV, Clock DVA, Chelsea, Early Police, totally immersed in what later became indie. And no, man, I felt it had very limited horizons, right. Very faux politics. It was all about provocation and look at me and I hate you, and I totally got it. That really was great for about 15 minutes in 76, 77. But the effective stigmatizing of your Pink Floyd, of your Stone, of your Beatles. No, Elvis, Beatles, or the Rolling Stones in 1977 was one of the the very first Clash single. No, I hated that. I found that completely reactionary and bullshit. You know, I'd been living with people, I'm 18 in this hippie house where we used to grow grass plants in the garden. It was the heat wave of 76. And these things would grow like triffids about 12 feet high. And they were all older than me, and one's into Buddhism, and one has been on the hippie trail. And, you know, it's about 12 of us in this old boarding house. And to me, it was really exciting and interesting. There were still terrible moments, as many wankers in that house as there was in punk. But there was also far more interesting people with far more interesting ideas about reality and life, as opposed to this, the kids are united, you know. Fuck the kid. I don't care about the kids. I was a kid. I don't care about the others. To me, that was small stuff for people with small brains. I was interested in what lay beyond, and I still am. And the way for me to get there was always through reading. If you're going to be a really good writer, you've got to be a really great reader. And so it was the music that felt more like that experience, hence albums, hence experimental music. I loved experimental music, whether it was Stockhausen or Yes, or Miles Davis or whatever. I love that search for some kind of new original feeling. And punk quickly felt formulaic to me. I also personally always hated the 80s fashion. That there's something really anal and uptight about the whole thing. You know, when they show those old clips on the TV of like Top of the Pops in 1973, and there's Alice Cooper, and there's all these gorgeous girls doing these really kind of flowing, beautiful, free kind of dancing. And then you get a clip of Spandau Ballet or whoever, the Jam, and they're all very staccato, and because it's like it's anti-70s. You know, we are now. You know, we can't pose anymore. We can't throw shapes. We can't look like we're actually enjoying it. We're kind of ironic. You know, so Kerrang to me offered an escape from all that. I'd worked with all those artists. And Kerrang offered me, and the Music Press, I hated the guys on the NME and Melody. The Melody Maker was good. The NME was such pompous arseholes. The ones that were cool weren't the ones that did well there. People like Mark Ellen, very minor writer on the NME, but great friend in those days, used to have a great laugh. And of course, he went on to form Smash Hits, then Q, then Mojo, then Word.
And he was in a band with Tony Blair, wasn't he?
Yes, they were at Oxford together.
Yeah.
I didn't know that then, but I didn't know who Tony Blair was then. Kerrang was it felt like Roger Rabbit, you know, where they go through the tunnel and they come out into Cartoon Town. Kerrang for me was like Cartoon Town, and you didn't have to go back. I thought it would last 5 minutes. And 9 years later, I'm thinking, I feel like 9 years is more than enough of this. Like, where does my life go next? I was in that phase. But while it lasted, to me, it was the antidote to the 80s. It was what these days we'd call non-PC. James Brown, who invented Loaded magazine in the early to mid 90s, he used to work on Sounds, who were in the next office along. And he's told me so many times that the whole ethos of Loaded was based on what he used to see going on at Kerrang. You know, because we'd run pictures of sexy ladies, you know, lady killers, and we were always celebrating people like Ozzy Osbourne and Lemmy, all these characters that they just didn't have in Morrissey and miserable Paul Weller. You know, Shane MacGowan, a great exception, but the rest was so sort of, they were obliged to be serious, and it was so boring. Whereas we were the opposite. And so from that point on, really, I have tried to get the hell out 2 or 3 times, but they just pull me back. They pull me back. But it really is the stories. My father was a musician. He was an Irish / Scottish musician. And he'd born in Ireland, lived there, then Scotland. And in the 50s, he was playing that really lively Dubliners type, you know, crazy folk Irish Scot stuff. And he eventually wound his way down to London. And when he got together with my mum and I came along, and then I got 3 younger brothers, that was sort of the end of his career as a professional musician. But he still played at weekends in folk clubs or Irish pubs or Scottish places. And he had a regular band, and then they would come back at like 2 in the morning and wake me up out of bed. This is when I'm like 6 or 7, and drag me down. They'd be all there with the big fire and drink, and they'd be they'd be playing the music. Then the music would finally die down, and then began the stories. And even as a child, I was enchanted to see these big, crazy guys laughing their asses off over some tale on the road, or do you remember the time? And the police were just round the corner. Yeah, I mean, it was just a delight. I didn't understand half of it, I realize now.
Mm.
But I saw the laughter, I saw the crack. And that was something that I saw again, as I say, when I started working with Ozzy, Lizzie, Phil Mogg. I mean, Iron Maiden were always great fun. But name anybody really from those days, and there was an incredible story and a wonderful time to be had if you could just get in that room, you know.
So in terms of the let's say the music, because if you're not if you don't buy wholesale into the music, I guess excuse me, that gives you a certain objectivity, doesn't it? Because you're not subjectively identifying and saying, I'm never going to be able to criticize this. You can stand back and you can look at it in a different way, which in itself is what a journalist should be about. And you sort of started off the interview saying about revealing the truth. Now, an example for me was your one of your recent books on Prince. And I never knew that he was addicted to drugs from at least 1984. And I never knew that the drugs that he was on that eventually killed him were 30 to 40 times stronger than heroin. And that's the sort of information that probably needs to be right at the core of it to allow to fill the vacuum. I mean, and also your biography, obviously, on the Doors. And there's so much of a vacuum that's being filled by different people around Jim's death. And obviously, and sadly, with the Doors, the obsession has become with Jim's death, whereas it really should be a lot more than that, much more holistic. So it must be quite frustrating for you at times as well, but then brilliant for you to be able to go and be this truth seeker.
Well, I think, you know, the artists you've just mentioned, Prince and the Doors and Jim Morrison, they have become almost mythological beasts, you know, biblical. Yes. You know, they've been written. The story has been told so many times, and even when it's told very, very well, it becomes the orthodoxy. And the mistake I think a lot of storytellers or writers make is they want to piece it together in their own voice, but they want to piece together from the existing pieces, because it's gone down. I mean, my book on Hendrix in 2019, two riders were approaching. My desk is still littered with biographies of Jimi Hendrix, and they all repeat the same stories. And you look at you know, if you think of a picture of Jimi Hendrix, there's, you know, always some kind of Carnaby Street aspect to it, or Woodstock. And, you know, you start looking at the story without trying to find the pieces and how they fit, just going, I don't know the story. I'm not going to read all these other, I don't need to. We've all absorbed these. It's like the story of Jesus. We've all absorbed it so many times. We get it. We know the rough idea, right? I try and throw that out and go, no. What actually happened? And, you know, turns out Hendrix was in London for about less than 9 months. Turns out that his own band used to describe him as an honorary white man. Turns out he hated a lot of the people that fawned over him, like Pete Townsend. Turned out he'd been a pimp. Turned out he didn't come out of the Air Corps in America because he injured his leg in a parachute jump. Turns out he pretended to be gay for 9 months in order to get a discharge. Turns out a million things I'd never known or read. And I just felt, you know, so this is just one example, but same with the Doors. They kind of have themselves to blame, because Ray Manzarek completely traded on the idea that Jim could still be alive till the day Ray died. And it was bullshit. And I think it went beyond, it began as almost like a marketing tool, because the Doors are more or less forgotten after Morrison died. until American Prayer came out in 1980. And Ray had just been kind of living off the fumes of, did Jim really die? Did Jim fake his death? You know, I mean, you could kind of fly that rubbish in the 70s or 80s because we didn't have access to information like we have now. And stories of great bands weren't as well told as they have become since. But to me, it's just ridiculous. And to me, it bordered into self-delusion to the point where Ray had told these stories so many times, he was sticking to them.
And of course, no one here gets out of alive in 1981. Became a definitive biography, but it represents everything you've just said because it was full of so many inaccuracies, and yet it was bought by so many people who were into the Doors. And
most of it was written by a guy who was 14.
I know.
When he hung out fetching sandwiches in the Doors office.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting book, but it's like Hammer of the Gods. It's a nice bit of fun, and at the time it seemed extraordinary. But if you look at them again now, they're incredibly dated and very low expectations, and a lot of coulds and shoulds, and it is said, and all this stuff. It comes from a time when it was fun to read about rock stars as somehow other, greater, more interesting. And I always come to the place of, no, they're not even a tiny bit. They're just human beings. And often they did many great things for all the wrong reasons. And sometimes they did terrible things for all the right reasons.
One of the really interesting things in your Doors biography, which again I had no idea about, was Jim's relationship with Linda McCartney, and this sort of you sort of tempt us with the idea that actually she was very promiscuous. Which then, of course, it then bounces you on to think, well, how come she ended up with Paul McCartney? Why was he attracted to somebody who slept around so much back in that time? Do you know what I mean? Especially when you've got this illusion of Paul McCartney being reasonably clean cut.
Well, you've just said it. It's because we have an image of Paul McCartney. We also tend to think of Paul McCartney. I mean, this guy's a living legend. I would say most rock stars I know have ended up marrying groupies.
Ozzy.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, more than just Ozzy.
Yeah, I know.
Way more. And I would say honestly, at least 75%, I think, end up with groupies. And the reason for that is, in my opinion, is that they're groupies. They know what it's like to hang out with famous musicians. They're not super fans who everything is awesome and wow. And, you know, fans are tiresome to rock stars. They're tiresome. They can't wait for them to leave. But groupies know how. It's not just sex. It's being a good hang, what they call a good hang. Great chick to have around, great people, never boring, fun, gets it. And when you do screw around, which they all do, she gets it. You know, she's not a civilian. She's not a civilian. She gets it, and you have to get it. You know, this is not a fairy tale of love. This is nearly always a male rock star whore getting together with a female rock groupie. I'm not even going to say whore. I think the rock star is the whore because he gets paid, and he will fuck anything. So to me, yeah, Paul McCartney, Linda must have been great after all the. Every time you walk in the room, here comes this American chick who knows more about it than you do, and whose family way richer than yours, and she's not asking for your autograph. She's saying, "Hey, have you met Jimmy? No, he's great. I'll introduce you." You know, great people to hang with, and And who else did people like Paul McCartney get to kind of have some proper fun with? So that's why, in a nutshell, that's why.
In terms of, you know, looking back over the whole career for you specifically, and this storytelling, and you've come across so many people who've told these amazing stories, who I say out of the blue, but it probably was it was they died young. And you've got, you know, you've mentioned Phil Lynott, you've mentioned Bon Scott, and of course many others that you actually sat in a room with, and you know, you drank with, and maybe smoked with, and whatever, and had fun with. Has that been really difficult for you, or have you still managed to be able to distance it from more objectively, and you knew it was coming, so to speak, and roll on, in the words of AC/DC?
In my earlier career, when the only books I wrote were really what you'd call fan books, I used to say they should all have the same title: Bloody Good Blokes, you know, because those fan books, 30, 40,000 words, tons of pictures. And with rock stars and metal stars, you can do those books easily because there are so many great fun stories to tell without asking awkward questions or trying to get beneath the fun part. Very first book I ever had published was Diary of a Madman, which was the official biography of Ozzy Osbourne. And that was about probably 1/5 the size of my Zeppelin book in terms of words, but loads of color pictures, you know, and it was A4 size, soft cover, fans. So in those days, I didn't want to burn any bridges, because access was everything. You know, I would go back the next month, the next month, the next month. But as time wore on, by the time you get to my first really serious rock biography, which was Led Zeppelin, I'd been friends with Jimmy Page for 20 years. And we had talked about a book numerous times, and it got to the stage where I was bringing him multi-million-pound offers. And the deal was, it's not going to be a Bloody Good Blokes book, but it'll be like Chronicles by Dylan, or the Beatles anthology, or something deep, but we don't have to talk about drugs, which Jimmy hates to talk about. We don't talk about underage girls, and we don't talk about the occult. We turned, I said to him, the only book people know is Hammer of the Gods. Let's change that. And he came that close and then backed away. And so it's a long story, but eventually the publisher said, well, we're just going to do our own book. And I said to Jimmy, if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And they'll do another boring, shitty, same old. So he said, go for it. And I said, look, you can call me anytime if you want to put a flea in my ear about anything, or plant a seed, or do an interview, whatever you want to do. But that was the first time I decided I just couldn't play favors anymore. I couldn't make it something that Jimmy would find easy to read. I didn't give a shit anymore what Jimmy thought or anyone thought, just the reader. And because of that kind of communion, I ended up losing his friendship. But it's one of the best books I've ever done. I'm very proud of it. And I realized, though, the only way to do more work like that is to adopt the same approach. So the next book was on Metallica. And at the end of that, James Hetfield has said he will never speak to me again. And Lars Ulrich still rings me and says, hey, it's your favorite drummer. Because in the book, it suggests that actually he's not a very good drummer, which he isn't. But Lars gets it, and we talk, and we're still buddies. And James, I'm dead to him. Do I care? I'm not 25 anymore, desperate to go in and tell them what a great gig they've just done. You know, I've got 3 children. I've got my own life and my own work. And so with AC/DC, with Black Sabbath, you know, the beginning of the Black Sabbath book begins, they were scum and they knew it, based on something Ozzy had said to me. But I was trying to establish from the word go, this is not about your favorite band. This is not my favorite band. There is no favorite band in this. This is a story that you've never been told. And that got me in terrible trouble. We were talking about rock star wives earlier and how they meet. Not Sharon, but one of the other wives won't speak to me now because I told the story of how she actually met that particular member. And it is in the book, all the names and everything is in the book. And it's never been told before or anywhere since. And for that reason, she won't talk to me. I don't care. You know, of course, I'm sad that we don't talk, but not that sad. These people aren't in my life. You know, I'm at that age now where it doesn't matter. I'm not 25 hoping that the next time I show up, I'll be able to get a ticket, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't care. And I know the readers prefer it that way. Some of the younger readers don't get it. I sometimes get reviews on Amazon saying, it's just his opinion. It's just like his opinion. Like, what good is that? You know? But they're young, and they want to read the fairy tale. And there's loads of books that will keep them happy that do that, but not mine.
And it sounds very much to me, like, Mick, that it doesn't matter now to you when you write a biography whether the artist is alive or dead, because you've crossed the bridge, and so to speak, from that youth to now to a point now where you're talking about that person almost in, you know, as a third person in the context of the fact that whether the person is still breathing or not, you're still going to tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, and like you say, many rock journalists won't do that.
No, because they still, in their mind, be friends with the band. No band is your friend, ever. They're not even friends with each other. You know, they didn't. I mean, John Lennon famously said the Beatles got as big as they did because, in his words, they were the biggest bastards in the world. And musicians, you know, they write these beautiful songs sometimes, and it really is heartfelt stuff. And music is, you know, a fantastic medium. It intoxicates you and takes you to a place and all the rest of it. And it's entirely valid. But the musician themselves doesn't mean they're not a complete and utter arsehole. It doesn't mean they're not thick as shit. It doesn't mean they're not lying, devious, obnoxious, money-grubbing, drug addicted, sex addicted, entirely self-absorbed monsters. And when you've been around them for over 40 years, and it's not just musicians, it's the whole business, it's promoters, record companies, the deeper you go, the more you realize, the more you see the reality. And so, but when you're younger, and I say younger, you don't have to be that much younger, but when your head is in a different place and you're still looking up at the stage, you still want to feel that personal connection. Whereas I feel like I'm hovering over the stage looking down, going, I've seen this movie 100 million times. And I'm seeing things here that you can't see unless you've seen it 100 million times. So I'm going to give you that, because there ain't a lot of that out there for these groups, this world. I'm writing a book at the moment on LA metal in the 80s, sort of from Van Halen, sort of like from the first Van Halen album to Nevermind, which killed the whole thing, you know. And yes, there's some amazing music from that era, truly. But the story, the culture, how it arrived, the place it arrived, why the two things were so connected and reflected. And I can't do that and keep Nikki Sixx happy, or Axl Rose, or Ozzy, or whoever it might be. And I don't want to. I've got no interest. I want the reader to be turned on. I want the reader to go, man, have you seen this? You know. But younger writers, they haven't all written 30 or 40 books like me. They haven't had the career I've had. And they're still fans. You know, one of my golden rules always, and I used to say this to my 20 years ago to the writers I'd send out on classic rock. They would never listen, of course, but I had my own rule, because I'd started working for groups when I was 19 or 20. First at Step Forward, all the punk bands, and then a PR company called Heavy Publicity, which had Sabbath, Lizzie, Dire Straits, Journey, tons. Don't ever turn up in a band t-shirt. Don't go to meet Phil Lynott wearing a Thin Lizzy t-shirt. Don't go to meet Phil Lynott wearing a Status Quo t-shirt. Don't wear the fucking t-shirt, and do not ask him for an autograph, because you are now a fan, and that's you gone forever from their high regard. You're just now one of the others. And because they were fans, they didn't see the problem with that. But for me, it established the fact that you will never be critical. You'll believe every little old load of cobblers you're told, and go away and write a lovely puff piece with a big happy face on it. There's a place for that, but that isn't the area that interests me, or ever interested me as a reader, because I'm a reader. You know, I say I only care about the readers because I'm the biggest reader there is. You know, my life is littered with books and stuff to read. And it means something to me. Very little in life is authentic, particularly now. Who knows what's real anymore? I struggle with it every moment of every day, it feels like, since the Great Reset. And so it's very important that the books try very, very hard not to lie to you, not to lie to themselves. You know, when you go hunting for a story, stuff comes out that it's really awkward. And the temptation to smooth the edges and move it along are extremely strong, and that's the route 90% of music biographies take. But I let it fall. So, for instance, Led Zeppelin, that took me 2 years. I always say 2 years to write and research, and 20 years to live with Jimmy and Robert and John, and then another 20 beyond that as a fan, when I was a kid buying their records. But it took a couple of years, and at the start of it, to me, it was a no-brainer. Of course, they should get back together. What was Plant's problem? For the love of God, the Stones, the Who, we're now in the classic rock era. It's not 1988 anymore, it's 2007, you know. And by the time I ended that book, not because I had that thought in mind, but just through starting with an open mind and collecting the evidence and looking and thinking, more thinking than writing always. By the end of that book, I discovered that, in fact, I was with Robert 100%. I was so glad he didn't do the Reformation. And I totally don't blame him. And I totally pity Jimmy that he's like Miss Havisham, still all dressed up in his crazy moon suit, waiting to go on stage. And the rest of the world has moved on. And it is a tragedy, because he is an extraordinarily talented artist. Not the greatest guitarist in the world, but one of the greatest producers, music makers, visionaries, sonic monk, you know. And he's lost it. He's lost it. It's gone. He hasn't put out an album since 1997. What does he do all day? Play the fucking guitar, Jim. We don't need Led Zeppelin. Play me something abstract. Play me something instrumental. Do something. He just wants to go out and do Black Dog. And that to me is a dreadful tragedy. But I didn't have any of that figured out when I started the book. The book taught me, you know, so I know it sounds a bit, you know, karmic, but you've got to let the story reveal itself to you and not be afraid. Because it's, I mean, many times in my books, I felt the whole thing has got out of control. And I just wish we could just get it back on a slightly more logical path. But that ain't life, is it? Like, none of life is like that. And if you're going to try and capture that kind of moment, that reality, you've got to kind of have the courage to do it. And I don't mean, oh, I'm very bold. I mean, I'm terrified. I don't know. I put this stuff down. I'm like, but I stick with it and see where it goes. And that's been the greatest satisfaction for me as a writer, is having these books show me what the story is. And like I say, this particular area of music and artists is a treasure trove of these stories that don't get told well enough or often enough. So that's where I am.
I know you've got
I'm gonna have to go in a couple of minutes. I'm so sorry.
No, Mick. I know you've got a family engagement, and you used the word intoxicating before, and that's exactly how I feel just listening to you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully sometime in the future we can come back and talk again. But thank you so much for coming on 10 by 6. It's been an utter privilege.
My pleasure. Wonderful to speak to you, and let me know whenever you can squeeze me back in. I'll be there, I promise.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right. Cheers. Thank you, man.